Okay, this is the 6th lesson in our 8-week series on the book of Ecclesiastes. We just have 2 more to go, and the title of this lesson is Fastened Nails: Why Wisdom Matters in a World That Seems Meaningless. To begin with, I want you to turn to chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes. I want you to see the phrase that I got the title of this lesson from. Verse 11 of chapter 12 says this: "The words of the wise are as goads and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd." Now, if you know anything about nailing nails, you have to have something to nail it into. But when Solomon is saying vanity of vanities, all is vanity, and then goes on to describe everything that's vain, pointless. You remember what we said about the meaning of vanity? It has this idea of vapor or breathiness, intransience, temporality. Everything is passing away, just like a puff of vapor that you see coming out of someone's nostrils and mouth on a cold day. It's there, and then it just vanishes. He's saying all of existence is like that. It's vanity of vanity, is pointless. And not only does he mean temporality or that things will come to an end, he also is saying that things don't ultimately make sense. And what we've seen as the message of this book is that life under the sun, like existence that we see with our eyes, that we feel with our hands, that we could experience, it doesn't contain the key to its own meaning. So we're always going to find something in this life that's going to frustrate and confuse us. So if you go back to chapter 2, Solomon begins looking at the value of wisdom in light of the vanity of vanities. And what does he say about that? At first, in verse 13, he says of chapter 2, "Then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly." Okay, that's good. Wisdom is better than folly. We would agree with that, as far as light is from darkness. But then, right on the heels of that, in verse 15, look at your scriptures there in verse 15, he says, "Then I said in my heart, the same thing that happens to the fool happens to me." So one person lives their life really wisely and making wise investments and trying to do their best, and they're living wisely. And another person lives like a complete idiot and doesn't do anything wisely. And they both, what happens? Die. And Solomon looks at that and he says, then what was the point of being wise if both the wise man and the foolish man they died, okay? So he's saying in light of what things look like under the sun, without eternity in view, without God in view, it looks like being wise is absolutely pointless. And so it almost seems like Solomon, when he's sweeping everything away with his broomstick of vanity, vanity of vanities, vanity of vanities, like everything is being swept away, including wisdom. Is he just going to sweep wisdom out the door? It almost looks like he will. Well, what happens? Remember, he's driving us toward his ultimate conclusion, that not everything is ultimately vanity. Well, how does he do that? If, as he says at the beginning, everything is vanity, then there's no value, there's no good and bad. If you think about it, wisdom depends on there being good and bad. You say, it's bad to make that sort of investment. It's bad to drive recklessly, therefore wisdom tells you to drive carefully, right? So words of wisdom, you think about the wisdom you offer people as a parent or as a grandparent or as an employer or in any position, words of wisdom that you offer people, you base that wisdom on the reality of value. Some things are good, some things are bad. If all is vanity, there's no good and bad. And therefore, there's no point in offering words of wisdom. And therefore, words of wisdom would be like trying to hammer a nail into a cloud of smoke, into a puff of vapor. Well, is that where Solomon is going? I want you to picture the book of Ecclesiastes like you're getting into the passenger seat of a car and Solomon is at the wheel. And at times, he seems like a really reckless driver. Okay, we're going way faster than you feel comfortable going. And then he starts taking you down a lane, and ahead of the lane, there's a sign that says, "Bridge out ahead." And he gets you close enough to that lane for you to see the darkness and absurdity of life without God before veering off and swerving toward his intended conclusion, which is, hear the end of the matter. God's going to bring everything into judgment, whether it be good or bad. Okay? Everything is not ultimately pointless. It's like he veers towards saying, It's almost like wisdom doesn't matter, life doesn't matter, death doesn't matter, because all is vanity. He gets us close enough to see what life would be like without God, and then he takes us unflinchingly and faithfully toward that conclusion. No, there is coming a day when God's going to say, this is good, but that is bad. This is good, and that is bad. And that is the foundation. That's like the solid wood into which we can nail words of wisdom. The fact that God will bring every work into judgment. If there was no God that would ultimately decide between good and evil, there'd be no point in wisdom. There'd be no value at all. There'd be no difference between killing a baby before it's born, killing it after it's born. There'd be no reason for restraining war and chaos if it weren't for the fact that there is value, and that value comes only from God. So wise living, here's the next blank. Wise living ultimately depends on the fact that there is a God who is wise enough, good enough, and powerful enough to eventually punish every evil and reward every good. That wise living really depends on that. It depends on there being a God who in the end will bring every work into judgment. And so, what does the theme of Ecclesiastes teach us with regard to wisdom? Well, just to remind you why we're doing it this way, we're looking at Ecclesiastes as being a river with multiple currents, and any current that you dip into takes you down toward the conclusion of the whole matter. And so we're dipping into the current of wisdom. What is Ecclesiastes teaching us about wisdom? As we dip into that current, again, it takes us toward the conclusion. Ecclesiastes teaches us although life under the sun, that's what goes in those blanks there in the quotations. And I'm going to faithfully put those words under the sun in quotations because I want to alert you to the fact that that means life as we know it, that life under the sun will not always vindicate godly wisdom. In the end, it is the only way to live since God is the sovereign judge. So here's the way we're going to structure this lesson to give you a brief overview. Look at the gray bars on your handout. 3 questions. Why does wisdom matter? In light of the fact that Solomon says near the beginning, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Is wisdom vanity at all? Why does wisdom matter? Second question is, where does wisdom begin? And the third question is, what does wisdom look like? And of course, we have some application and next steps, which we won't go over in this time, but you can look at on your own. So the first question is this: why does wisdom matter? Well, we've already kind of hinted at the answer there. When viewed in light of God's ultimate judgment of everything, the words of the wise are valuable for right living. Now, at times, Solomon has said, what does it matter? Because all is vanity. But then in his wisdom or Proverbs section, he starts saying, this is better than that. Wisdom is better than folly. See, he's not abandoning the reality of value. Why does wisdom matter? First of all, wisdom will often help you succeed in life under the sun. Wisdom will often help you succeed in life under the sun. This is what we mostly agree and think when we think about wisdom. That guy's really wise in the way he handles his business. It helps him succeed in life under the sun. That person is really wise in his relationships. He succeeds in life under the sun. And it gives these wisdom statements here. If you look at chapter 10 and verse 10, here's something that's wise, okay? Comes to chopping down a tree. How many of you have used an axe before to chop down a tree? I've used a machete to chop down trees. A little more time consuming than an axe, but it does the job eventually. Well, what is Solomon saying here? If the iron is blunt, if you don't sharpen the edge of it, then must he put to more strength. But wisdom is profitable to direct. What is he saying? He's saying, if you have a really dull blade, it's going to be more efficient in the end to take some time, sharpen the blade, and then cut, instead of just wailing away with a blunt axe. Now, obviously, Solomon is not writing to lumberjacks. That's not his whole point in saying that. What he's saying is wisdom helps you become more effective. In fact, if you look at chapter 7, verse 19, he says that wisdom strengtheneth the wise more than 10 mighty men which are in the city. See, wisdom is better than brute force. Chapter 9, verses 17 and 18, the words of the wise are heard in quiet more than the cry of him that ruleth among fools. In other words, wisdom is way better than just shouting and yelling. It's actually going to be effective in solving a conflict. I'm sure that you all have had this experience where there's an argument or there's some sort of disagreement and there's just a lot of noisy words and shouting, but there's not real wise thinking through this. And Solomon is saying, exercising wisdom does help you succeed in life under the sun. Wisdom, he says, you don't need to turn there, is like the protection of money. Like money can protect you from a lot of things. That's why we have insurance. And wisdom does the same thing. If you can handle yourself wisely, that's good protection. It can help you win favor with others, including the ruler. So if you're really wise in the way that you handle yourself, then people are going to like you and people are going to be more inclined to help you succeed. So there's lots of benefits in being a wise person. And Solomon knows those benefits, and he's saying, you act wisely, you do things that are wise, it's going to take you places. And that is one very clear and obvious aspect of wisdom. But that's not the whole story about wisdom. We like to stop there. In fact, a lot of people do when it comes to wisdom. But Solomon, you can depend on him to be brutally and often uncomfortably honest about life. Because he says wisdom has some severe limitations. Look at chapter 10 and verse 1. Really picturesque imagery here. Dead flies cause the ointment of the apothecary to send forth a stinking savor. Well, what's that an illustration of? That's an illustration of a little folly, how that affects him that is in reputation for wisdom and honor. See, wisdom, while it helps you succeed, it's pretty fragile. I mean, it can, a little folly, a burst of temper, a unwise, unethical move with your money can undo years of wisdom. Wisdom has its limitations. Not just sin, as in folly, but unfortunate circumstances. One of the main emphases in the book of Ecclesiastes is the sovereignty of God. God rules over all. There's really no such thing as fortune or misfortune or unfortunate circumstances. But this is what Solomon is saying in chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. In chapter 9, he says, I returned and saw under the sun. Again, he is emphasizing that he's looking at life as we know it, that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, and here's what interests us, neither the bread to the wise. Sometimes really wise people lose their bread. Sometimes people that have acted very wisely in their lives, sometimes bad things happen to them. Is wisdom a foolproof sort of thing that can prevent unfortunate circumstances from happening to us? No, because in a fallen world, these are the sort of things that happen. What else does it limit us with? Well, easily thwarted by sin or unfortunate circumstances, it does not help one comprehend God's inscrutable ways. Another really important theme in Ecclesiastes. Solomon has been looking for the picture on the puzzle box. I want to see all the parts of my life at one time in a way that makes sense to me. And Solomon looks for it all over the place. He looks for it in wisdom. He looks for it in career achievements. He looks for it in pleasure. He looks for it in relationships. And he sees that he can't find that. All he could find is these scattered pieces, and some of them don't seem to fit. And so he concludes, no matter how wise you are, you'll never understand everything that God is doing in this world. You may think that you've got everything figured out, and then something's going to come along, and you're going to think, that does not make sense. I do not understand why God would allow that. I don't understand why there would be such unfairness in my life. It doesn't make sense to me. And Solomon says, no matter how much you search, no matter how wise you are, God has withheld that picture on the puzzle box from us. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't know God's ultimate purpose, right? We know that God is bringing everything toward an intended conclusion. Solomon said in chapter 3 and verse 11, he's making everything beautiful in his time, but we don't always see how he's doing that. And so Solomon says wisdom has a limitation. What? I can't figure out everything God is doing. It does not guarantee proper reward for its great accomplishments. And you see the two references there I have in parentheses there. Both of those are little anecdotes or stories about a wise person who did a great thing, and then people forgot about him. And your tendency would be to think, well, that's kind of disappointing. I was hoping that wisdom would pay off, like maybe people would think better of me and I'd have a legacy. Well, that's a limitation of wisdom under the sun. It doesn't always yield the rewards we want it to. The question is, why? Why is it that wisdom has these limitations? Well, here's the answer. Wise decisions are not always followed by success under the sun because, right, we live in a fallen world. This is the nature of the world that we live in. This is the effect of sin. This is the twisting of God's originally perfect universe. When God created everything is for His glory, everything to reflect His kingly majesty, having delegated to humans the responsibility to further His kingdom. That's what He was doing to Adam and Eve. They were kings over that garden, and God had told them to be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth and make it a beautiful reflection of the character of God that it was intended to be. What did? They choose to put themselves at the center of the world, marring God's originally perfect creation, and now all of the world is mangled in a way that doesn't make sense to us. And we can trace the incomprehensibility of our lives, the perplexities, the pains, the frustration. We can always trace it back to the fact that man has chosen to sin. Okay, it's life in a fallen world. Wisdom, it should work, right? It should make us succeed. Living wisely should always yield the benefits that we expect it to. Not in a fallen world, does it? The reason for these limitations. The second one here, wise decisions will often appear foolish under the sun. And here's where we're getting to the heart of what wisdom is. Because wise living means living in light of higher realities. This, again, is the conclusion that Solomon is driving toward. God's going to bring everything into judgment. Can I see that right now? Is it obvious to me right now that God is going to declare that to be right and that to be wrong? Sometimes crime pays. Sometimes cheaters do prosper. Is it obvious under the sun that that's not ever going to happen? It's not, but it's living in the light that I know one day God will say that was wrong, and God will punish the wrong, and God will reward the right. But that's not a reality we could see right now. And so sometimes when you act ethically at work, when all the pressure is to act unethically, to your people who don't see the fact that there is a God who decides between right and wrong, who don't see that, your ethical choices look stupid, right? Have you ever been in a circumstance like that where people say, why would you do that? Why would you return that item? Why would you come back with the receipt and say, you gave me the wrong change? Why would you do that? That's just foolish, because you're living in light not just of life under the sun, but of a higher reality, right? Wisdom acts according to this higher reality, which means that sometimes the things we do look foolish to people who don't understand that. That's because of the effect of the fall. This explanation lies at the fact that godly wisdom involves shaping your actions and attitudes to the character of God, and not just the character of this fallen world. Okay, now here's where we understand that wisdom matters. Okay, why does wisdom have the limitations? Because we live in a fallen world, and because wise living means living in light of higher realities. What goes in the parentheses there is God. Okay, ultimately that's God. What is wisdom? It's the fear of God. It's shaping your attitudes and actions according to the character and the plan of God. God is holy, God is righteous, God is love, God is trustworthy. God will one day reward the righteous and punish the wicked. I'm living like that right now, and that may look stupid to some people right now, but ultimately that's going to be vindicated in the end. Well, why does it matter? The question is, what evidence do I have that I'm not the foolish one? Because wouldn't it be horrible to come to the end of your life and realize you were living like that, all ethically and all upright and everything, and it was pointless? Has that thought ever kind of cropped up in the back of your mind? What's the point of trying to do right? What's the point of trying to be pure, live purely, morally? What's the point of treating people kindly? How do I know that this isn't just one big joke and someone's going to pull the rug out from under me? This is where wisdom points to Jesus Christ. And I want us to get this. This is so important. The answer to this question, what evidence do I have that these realities are true, is precisely where Ecclesiastes anticipates Christ. I want you to turn to Acts chapter 17. As you turn there, recall that the realities to which Solomon is pointing upon which he predicates his whole book is God's going to bring everything into judgment, and this life is not all there is to it. And that's the foundation for wise living. That's that solid plank of wood into which wise sayings can be driven, and it's instead of just being like put into a puff of smoke. So we're asking the question, how do I know that wise living is not pointless? Well, this is near the end of Paul's message to the people of Athens. Verse 30 of Acts 17, the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent. 31, because he has appointed a day in the which he will, what? Judge the world in righteousness. God's going to bring every work into judgment. Does that ring a bell? Ecclesiastes 12 at the end of the chapter, whether it be good or bad, with every secret thing. And how is he going to do it? By that man whom he hath ordained. Who is that? That's Jesus Christ. Whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he hath raised him from the dead. What is the assurance that God is going to one day judge the world, that this life is not all there is to it? What's the assurance we have? The resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. That was the definitive historical proof where God broke into human history and said, once for all, this life is not all there is to it. I'm going to prove it to you by showing you a higher order in which the dead come back to life, in which the sick are healed, in which a human can walk with God perfectly and never sin. The Son of God, Jesus Christ. Now that is, the proof of that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And it's by that man who rose from the dead, Jesus Christ, that God is going to judge the world. So when you ask, what's the point of my living ethically? What's the point of my living wisely? Well, the proof that you can live according to that higher reality is that Christ has risen from the dead. There is a God, and there is a day when Jesus Christ will judge the living and the dead, and therefore your living purely does matter. Your living wisely does matter. You're refusing to give into lust and to give into dishonesty and disobedience. It does matter because Jesus rose from the dead. Wisdom points to Christ. That's why in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 30, when Paul says Jesus Christ is our wisdom, because he is the ultimate demonstration of the fact that this life is not all there is to it. Remember, I told you at the beginning, one of my goals for this series is to help you see how Ecclesiastes points to Christ. How does it point to Christ? It anticipates needs that only Christ can fulfill. It unveils deep longings in our hearts that can only be met by the one who's going to wave his scepter of righteousness over everything and make all things new. And as Peter describes in the end of his epistle, that's going to be a world in which righteousness dwells. Okay? Yes, Ecclesiastes is a book. It's all about Jesus. And it points to Christ. So, God's judgment of all things, the realities that Christ demonstrated is God's judgment on sin. He judged sin in Christ on the cross, raised him from the dead, demonstrating life under the Son is not the end-all existence. And this is why the message of the cross is to them that perish what? Foolishness. Okay? It's foolishness. And here's where I want to give you a word of warning. Some people approach the Bible as if it is a handbook of successful living. People that are really big on finances, they say, oh, you want to know how to get rich? You want to know how to make money? Well, guess what? The Bible tells you everything you need to know about that. Isn't the Bible wonderful? Oh, you want to know how to succeed in your relationships? Well, the Bible has everything to tell you about that. And the danger here is turning the Bible into a handbook for success under the sun. You see what's going on there? And while it may, on the one hand, come across as, oh, these people, they love the Bible, and maybe they do, but what they misunderstand is sometimes wise living doesn't mean getting richer. Sometimes wise living doesn't even mean getting healthier. Sometimes wise living means relationships being broken. Didn't Christ say allegiance to Christ actually supersedes human relationships? See, what's going on here is that while sometimes living according to the Bible may cause you to succeed, employers like to hire someone who's going to be honest. But sometimes living wisely according to life above the sun, according to God, doesn't cause you to succeed in certain areas under the sun, because that same employer will tell you to do something that's dishonest, and you say, I can't do that. Where did the Bible, being a book all about how to help you in your career, go? You see the danger of people putting forth the Word of God as if this is just a book full of tips and advice to how to make your life work more smoothly for you? That's not it at all. And I encourage you to beware of that sort of perspective. While those people may on one hand appear to be lifting up the Word of God, in fact, they're undermining its very message, which teaches us not to live for this world, but for the world to come. That's living wisely. That's living in the light of there is a God, and He's going to bring every work into judgment, whether it be good or evil, with every secret thing. And therefore, what's the whole duty of man in light of that? Fear God and keep His commandments. Why does wisdom matter? It matters because God will bring everything into judgment, and because life under the sun is not all there is. The work of Christ is the ultimate demonstration of God's earth-transcending wisdom. And wise living will often appear what? You know what goes in there. Foolish to those who do not understand God and His ways. That's why Paul says, we are fools for Christ's sake. And that's okay. Wise living will often appear foolish to those who do not understand God and His ways. Where does wise living begin? Wise living begins, and I'm going to give this cryptically or a little mysteriously to you at the beginning. Wise living begins at the end. Well, what do I mean by that? Wise living begins when we realize the end of our knowledge. Wasn't this a theme in Ecclesiastes when Solomon says, I've been so wise, and yet I haven't been able to figure out all of life? The fool is the person, Solomon says in chapter 10, verse 14, who babbles on and on about what he thinks he knows. The person who babbles on about what he thinks he knows but does not is called a fool. The wise person, you start being wise at a point when you understand that you're not. Now, that's kind of ironic, isn't it? But that's the way it works. Right? Because when you think that you know everything, that's one of the biggest evidences that you don't. And it's really hard to convince people otherwise. How can someone who thinks they know everything be convinced that there's something they don't know? If one of the things that they're convinced they know is the fact that they know everything. Does that confuse you? I think I confuse myself. Let's just put it simply. Wise living begins when you realize that you don't know everything. But also, and even more forcefully and impactfully for us, the wise living begins when we realize the end of our lives. And I want us to turn to chapter 7 and verses 1 through 10. This is the whole point of this discussion here. When Solomon says in verse 2 of chapter 7 that it is better to go to the house of mourning, where's the house of mourning? That's a funeral. Then to the house of feasting, that's a party. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. Why would it be better for you to go to a funeral than to a party? Because at the funeral, you start thinking about, that's my end. So what does that lead you to think about? What's going to happen to me after my life under the sun? And that's where wise living begins, isn't it? When you realize, I'm going there. And I better understand what's happening to me after that. That there is a coming day of judgment. That there is a day when I'm going to be called account. Now, for those of us who are in Christ, Christ paid the judgment for our sin, and therefore that day of judgment for us will be a day of vindication. But wise living begins when you understand this life is not all there is to it. See, no one who lives as if this life is ultimate can live a wise life, no matter how successful they are in any other area. If they think that their life ends when their heart stops beating, when they're brain dead, they are fools. Because the fool says in his heart, what? There is no God, and there's nothing happening to me after this life. That is the ultimate folly. And wisdom must begin when you realize this life's not all there's to it. The force of Ecclesiastes 7, 1 through 10 is that wisdom comes from viewing life from the end. And finally, under this section, where does wisdom begin? Wise living begins when we realize the end of the matter, and I have that in quotations because I'm quoting the end of the matter, the end of the book. When we realize, and what is the end of the matter? God's going to bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or evil. That's the end of the matter. That's the conclusion toward which he's going. And so wise living begins with understanding that. Now, isn't that where wise living began with you? Think about when you got saved. Think about when you trusted Christ. Did it not come with an understanding that I'm going to spend eternity somewhere, and I don't want it to be in hell, and I want it to be in heaven? Whatever your thoughts, whether it was a child or a teenager or an adult, whatever it was, there had to come some point which you realized, I am going somewhere after I die. Otherwise, why would you have trusted Christ? That's where wise living begins. What does this wisdom look like? It looks like fearing God. And by fearing God, what I mean simply is that explanation above, shaping your attitude and actions according to the character and purposes of God. That means trusting God even when things are difficult. That means rejoicing in God even when you don't understand what's going on. That's living in the fear of God. Listening to God. It's better to draw near to listen. Listening to God is part of what it means to live wisely. And finally, accepting life with its pain, with its pleasures, and even with its perplexities as given from God or as a gift from God. Remember, we've talked about this several times, that enjoying life is part of what it means to fear God. Like if you are having a miserable life, if you think, life stinks, I hate my life, if you think that way, you're not fearing God. Why? Because the fear of God means accepting even the good, simple gifts that God has given you and enjoying them as a gift from God. Now, I do want to mention, before we close here, under the applications and next steps, wise living, according to Ecclesiastes, looks a lot like faith. In fact, it's almost like I haven't even used that word yet, but that's really what this is. Living according to unseen realities. Wise living is living a life of faith. It's living life according to the fact that there is a God. He's real. He's spoken to me. He loves me. And one day he's going to bring all this to completion, and he'll make everything beautiful in his time.